Hmm. Should I make a video about free will? The coin says yes. Now, the question is, does the decision to flip a coin mean that I have free will? I am Atheist for Humanity, and you are watching a video about free will. To talk about free will, we have to define free will. And we also have to define something called determinism. And I'm going to tell you what both of those are now. In this video, I'll be defining free will as the ability to have made another choice if I had wanted to. It is the belief that I have agency beyond the physical cause and effect of the world. Now, the opposite is the belief of determinism. That means that basically the world is a series of cause and effect. Everything is subject to a larger chain reaction, and everything we do is beyond our choice because we're subject to forces acting on us that are beyond our control, and therefore they cause us to make the actions that we make, and that everything is predetermined and therefore predictable. Now you'll notice I put a question mark down at the bottom here because there is actually a third possibility, which I'll talk about at the end of the video. So for now, we're going to focus on free will and why I don't think it exists. Okay, so I'd like to begin by talking about how free will is conceptualized. And to do that, I've drawn a little diagram for us. Now, most of us think of ourselves as having something called the self, and usually what I refer to as our mind. This is the collection of all our thoughts, experiences, memories, feelings, opinions, knowledge, all of those things that we think of as us. This doesn't necessarily have to be a spiritual belief, but religious people would call this the soul. And we think of this as being an entity that acts on our brains and therefore uses our brain as a tool to act on our bodies and carry out actions. Uh, the idea of free will necessitates that there must be agency beyond the organ of the brain because there must be something that is us that makes decisions because we know that the brain is subject to the laws of physics and it is a series of chemical reactions. And in a minute, I'll talk more about why the brain cannot possibly be free itself to make decisions. So, the problem here with this model is that there's actually no proof to prove that the self exists, that there is any metaphysical being that acts on the brain. We run into a problem which I call the barrier of the brain. That's not a term that you'll find other philosophers use, but the same idea is expressed by many people. It is the idea that anything that we do, think, say, can be traced only back to the brain's actions, and we have no ability to prove that anything else causes the actions of the brain. It is indeed the brain that causes our actions, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So this is the fundamental problem of free will. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, so what if we can't prove that there's a metaphysical self within me that acts on the brain? I mean, can't my brain be making decisions by itself? Can't it be free of influences and make its own decisions? Well, I don't think so. And let's talk about why. So I've drawn up another diagram here for us. And to answer this question, we really have to go back to birth. So you see here, of course, everyone knows that we are the result of our parents' shared genetic makeup. And We are also the result of the physical construction of our bodies and brains. And what I mean by that is that when we're born, the actual construction of our brain matters. The amount of neuron connections that we're born with matters. The amount of folds, the either the defaults or lack of defaults that we're born with, all of that matters because it constricts what we're able to do and it defines who we are. Okay, so, what does this mean for decision making? Let's talk about that a little bit because that's at the core of what we're talking about. Am I free to make the decision that I want to? Well, to talk about that, we have to look at that perceived division that I was talking about earlier between the brain and the mind, or what we perceive as the mind. Now, when making decisions, there are three basic factors that affect our decision making, which I've put up here. That is our predispositions, and that's an umbrella term for everything from our genetic makeup to our temperament, our past knowledge and experiences. Our current mood, which we know changes from time to time, but is still the product of chemical processes in the brain, and then outside stimuli, which of course is stands for a wide variety of things that we encounter and changes on a regular basis. So real quick, I can give the example of why did I make this video? Well, I have a predisposition for philosophical topics. Something about the way I was born and the construction that my brain ended up having pushes me towards philosophical topics. So I like to discuss these things. Mood. I was in the mood to exercise my mind by making this video. Outside stimuli, you could say that the attention that I get from my followers is a motivating outside factor that pushes me to take actions like making this video. Now, okay, so right now you're thinking, so what? We know that these factors exist and we know that they affect our decision making. But how does that prove that we couldn't have made another choice? Because remember, we defined free will as having the ability to make another choice if we wanted. Well, the truth is that these factors alone don't prove that we couldn't have made another choice. But the idea is that if we had the ability to measure and tally all of these factors and all of the stimuli, which are causes, that we would be able to predict the effect. Now, the truth is that that task is just too daunting for anyone to carry out empirically. But we do have proof that there is not a metaphysical agency acting on our brains, and that it is, in fact, our brains that is the be all and end all of our actions and thoughts. Okay? We think of ourselves as conscious because we are self-aware. That's one of the key requirements to be a conscious being. But self-awareness is actually limited. Uh, that is our brains, are not actually aware of everything that our brains are doing. And it's more than just those passive functions that keep your organs going. Even in the process of decision making, we don't know everything that our brain is doing. And this is evidenced by experiments in brain activity and decision making. To demonstrate this, I'm going to play you a short clip by neuroscientist John-Dylan Haynes, who did some research, or rather presented research on brain activity and decision making, and it clearly shows that our brain makes decisions for us before we're consciously aware of them. Watch here. Okay, so there you have it. You can see that the research shows that brain activity drives our actions beyond our conscious control. The reason that this is so monumental in the topic of free will is that it absolutely drives out this idea of the mind as a metaphysical agent that controls the brain. You see, there is only the brain, and we know that our brain is an organism subject to the laws of physics and subject to a series of cause and effect. There's no evidence to show that we can step outside of the series of cause and effect, leading all the way back to the genetic makeup of our very being before we were born. So, what about randomness? Is there randomness to decision making? Is there randomness to the chemistry in the brain? Does randomness even matter? Well, to talk about randomness, let's talk about dice. Uh, Something that a nerdy person like me uses quite often. So, we've always thought that dice are the best way to randomly make a decision. But we're starting to find out that dice may not be as random as we always thought. The truth is that we're figuring out the factors that affect a dice roll, such as the starting position that it's held in, the speed and trajectory that it's thrown on, the friction of the surface that it lands on, and how it lands on the surface. Researchers believe that as we grow the technology to measure all of these factors, we'll be able to accurately predict dice rolls, and we're starting to already see patterns in that. So that means that even something as wild as a dice roll may not be random at all. It's really all cause and effects. And the more you know about the cause, the more you can know about the effects. What about the coin flip that I made earlier? I made a decision with a coin flip. Does this alter whether I have free will or not? Um, some people say that if we really lived in a predetermined world, that subjecting yourself to randomness uh, is an act of free will. Well, unfortunately, that's not necessarily true. Uh, Randomness isn't control. It doesn't prove that I have agency because, again, there's nothing to prove that there was an agency forcing the brain to subject itself to randomness. Remember the brain barrier. That's the real problem. Um, we could easily say that I was born with a predisposition to subject myself to randomness, and the brain, as an organ itself, um, through its own processes, subjected itself to randomness and followed that decision. It doesn't mean agency. So that's the real problem with randomness. The other thing is, remember that question mark on the board at the beginning of the video? In a minute, I'm going to tell you about something that will make randomness really irrelevant. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of reasons why free will doesn't work, chiefly being that there's nothing to get us past the brain barrier. There's no proof that we have agency to act on our brain, but rather we are the manifestation of our brains, which are subject to the laws of physics and endless cause and effect from all kinds of variables. Now, do you remember the question mark at the beginning of the video? When I described that we'd be talking about free will and determinism, I made a question mark down at the bottom and said that there's a third option. And there is. And this is a lot like determinism, but it takes it a step further. And that is non-linear existence. This is an idea that there really is no time, and everything that is and ever could be already exists. So the idea of choice just doesn't exist. That's an illusion. So how does this concept work and why do I think this is a thing? Okay, nonlinear existence is an idea that we have to work our way up to. First, we have to talk about something called space-time. Space-time can be thought of as the underlying objective reality that really exists in the space between objects and the time between events. It is the truth about existence that physicists strive to figure out. That is what space-time is. The topic of space time is intrinsically linked to the question of free will because to really know if we have free will, we have to really know about our existence itself. So, this is where we start to work our way up to the idea of nonlinear existence. Okay, so nonlinear existence isn't just a philosophical idea that someone made up. There's actually real evidence behind it, and we're going to talk about that now. Now, you're probably familiar with the concept in sci fi movies where if one spaceship is moving extremely faster than another, closer to the speed of light, time is perceived differently by those people than another person moving much more slower. So we're going to build on that idea here. Let's talk about two observers moving relative to one another. The same type of research shows that these two observers don't agree on time, the time that has passed, space, the space between objects that they're looking at while moving, and the order of events, even, which I know is really counterintuitive, but there it is. Two moving observers will actually disagree on order of events in certain circumstances. So, what what does this leave us to have any agreement on? Because remember, to find the truth of what is objective reality, we have to have agreement. Objectivity is based on agreement. So if you can have two observers that don't agree on time, space, or order of events, what can you agree on? The answer is causality. The fact that one thing causes another. It's actually the only thing that two observers always agree on in experiments. So, what does that mean for the question of free will? Well, it actually has pretty major implications. Okay, now we get into the more complicated part, and I'm just going to give the main points of this idea, and I'm going to link a video that explains it in much more detail. So don't get worried if you're not making all the connections here. And that video will actually point you towards more research that goes into more depth. Okay, so the fact that observers don't agree on anything but causality led to the discovery of something called the space-time interval. That is a mathematical equation that acts as a measurement of distance between two events, not two locations like we're used to talking about, like here, at my house and across the street at the other house. No, um, a measurement of distance between two events, regardless of where they happened or when they happened. So this led a physicist named Hermann Minkowski to propose this idea of nonlinear existence because he said, well, what if we don't live in a three-dimensional world where we travel through time in a strictly forward motion? But what if we live in a four-dimensional reality where time is actually just another point on a map of objective space-time reality? So this idea is not 100% proven, but like I said, the research gives some evidence for this idea. And if that turned out to be true, that we lived in a 4D reality where time is actually just a point on space time geometry, well, that means that everything has already happened. There is no moving forward through time, and uh, our idea of going through day to day, moving through time, getting older, that's actually just an illusion of our minds because we're not able to perceive uh, all of our reality. And that would also mean that we can't possibly make any choices because everything has already been done. You would actually look like this. Your life from birth to death would just be an event in space time that exists as a whole. Everything would exist as a whole, from what we think of as the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe. It would all just be one entity. There is no beginning or end. Um, so, like I mentioned earlier, this blows the idea of choice and randomness right out of the water. It has really serious implications for the question of free will. We can't possibly be free to make choices if things have already happened. Now, I've mentioned before in text posts on my Tumblr blog about the idea of precognition and God. And if God could know everything that will ever happen, it's actually the same idea. If you can know everything that will ever happen, then it must have already happened, and therefore there is no changing it. And I'm not going to get into the implications of religion, faith in God, and free will right now, nor am I going to continue and go on and talk about, well, what does all this mean for morality and responsibility? But those are questions that I plan to tackle in the future. So let's recap. I don't believe that free will is possible because there is the brain barrier where we can't prove that we have agency to act on our brain, but rather all evidence points to the fact that it is our brain that creates us, and we are a manifestation of that organ, plain and simple. Um, the idea of a non-linear existence, if true, would negate all ideas of choice, randomness, or anything like that. Everything would already be done. It goes beyond determinism because even the idea of determinism assumes that things haven't yet happened. So, these are all the ideas why I think free will does not exist. And in a later video, like I said, I'll talk about the moral implications of that. And maybe in a separate video, I'll talk about how all these ideas um, relate to religious beliefs and why I think the religious beliefs don't quite make sense. Well, I am an atheist for humanity, and I thank you for watching this video. Please follow me on YouTube and go check out my Tumblr, atheistforhumanity.tumblr.com, where you'll see regular text posts on atheism, liberal politics, and general philosophy. Thank you very much.